After the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the early 19th century, many people believed a great injustice had finally come to an end. Ships no longer crossed the Atlantic carrying chained human beings, and on paper, the worst chapter of slavery seemed to be closing. But history rarely ends so cleanly. In the United States, the demand for labor on expanding cotton, sugar, and rice plantations did not disappear, and neither did the determination of slaveholders to protect their profits. What happened next is a story that is rarely explained in classrooms. Instead of importing enslaved people from abroad, plantation owners turned inward. Human lives were calculated, managed, and controlled through a system designed to increase the enslaved population from within. Families were no longer seen as families, but as numbers on a ledger. Childhood, parenthood, and even the future itself were reshaped by economic interests. This hidden system did not rely on ships or distant ports. It unfolded quietly on American soil, in fields, quarters, and marketplaces that looked ordinary to the outside world. Yet beneath the surface, it transformed generations of black lives and left scars that history is still trying to fully understand. In this video, we are going to explore that overlooked reality, not to shock, but to reveal, to understand how laws meant to end one injustice opened the door to another, to listen to the voices history tried to silence, and to ask why so many of us were never taught this part of the story. If you believe history should be told honestly, even when it is uncomfortable, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive. Now, let us begin by uncovering what happened after the trade ended and why its legacy still matters today. As the illegal ships faded from the horizon and the Atlantic trade officially ended, the cruelty of the system did not disappear, it changed its shape. On plantations across the American South, a quieter and more controlled form of exploitation took root, one that unfolded not in public markets or foreign ports, but within the daily routines of plantation life. Enslaved women found themselves at the center of this transformation, not because of who they were as individuals, but because of what their bodies represented to those who claimed ownership over them. These women were no longer viewed solely as laborers in the fields or the household. They were reduced to numbers in account books, valued for their ability to increase the enslaved population from within. Pregnancy became something imposed rather than chosen, timed and monitored to serve economic needs. The natural rhythms of life, love, family, recovery, rest were ignored entirely. What should have been moments of care and protection were replaced by pressure and control, enforced by a system that allowed no refusal and recognized no personal boundaries. This reality did not exist in isolation. It was directly connected to the earlier moment when the trade was abolished. Plantation owners, facing rising demand for labor and unable to purchase new workers from overseas, adapted with cold calculation. Growth now depended on births, and births depended on women who had no power to decide their own futures. Their lives became cycles of exhaustion, where physical strain was followed by brief pauses before the process began again. Each child born into this system was immediately marked, not as a son or daughter, but as future labor, future profit, or future sale. Yet the story is not only one of numbers and systems. It is also a story of human endurance under relentless pressure. Mothers formed quiet bonds with their children, knowing those bonds could be broken at any moment. They taught songs, whispered names, and passed down fragments of identity in stolen moments, even as the system worked to erase those connections. The emotional toll was immense, not because of a single event, but because of the constant uncertainty that hovered over every relationship. What made this system especially devastating was its normalization. It was not hidden from view. It was embedded in daily operations and justified through laws and customs that treated people as property. Overseers spoke of productivity. Owners spoke of investment. and the language of business masked the reality unfolding in the lives of women who were never allowed to speak for themselves. Their suffering was not accidental, it was organized, repeated, and sustained over decades. This chapter of history forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Ending one form of injustice does not automatically dismantle the systems that benefit from it. When the trade ended, slavery adapted, and the burden of that adaptation fell heavily on enslaved women. Their experiences connect the broader story of abolition to the lived reality on the ground, reminding us that progress on paper can coexist with deep cruelty in practice. Understanding this part of the story brings the earlier narrative into sharper focus. It explains how slavery did not merely survive after abolition efforts, but evolved, embedding itself even deeper into the fabric of American society. And it challenges us to look beyond simplified timelines, toward the human lives caught in between laws, profits, and history's silence. While enslaved women carried the most visible burden of this system, the experiences of enslaved men were shaped by a different, yet equally dehumanizing logic. As plantations adjusted to a world without the transatlantic trade, the value of an enslaved man was no longer measured only by his strength in the fields or his endurance under long hours of labor. For some, it became tied to something far more intimate, stripped of dignity and choice, and transformed into another tool for economic expansion. Within the closed world of the plantation, certain men were singled out based on age, physical condition, or perceived health. These selections were not marks of privilege, though they were sometimes described that way by owners seeking to justify their actions. Instead, they reflected a cold calculation. These men were assigned roles that reduced them to biological functions. Their identities reshaped to serve a system that saw no humanity in either parent or child. Their lives, like those of the women they were forced to connect with, were governed by schedules, commands, and expectations imposed from above. This role came with its own form of isolation. Men placed in this position were often separated from the broader community of enslaved people, not out of concern for their well-being, but to maximize control. They lived under constant observation, aware that compliance was expected and resistance carried severe consequences. Any sense of personal relationship or emotional connection was deliberately erased, replaced by a routine designed to produce results rather than families. The emotional weight of this arrangement was profound. These men were denied the right to form stable partnerships or claim fatherhood in any meaningful way. Children born from this system were not recognized as sons or daughters, but as additions to an owner's inventory. The absence of acknowledgement cut deeply, reinforcing a sense of powerlessness that extended far beyond physical labor. To exist without the right to name, guide, or protect one's own children was a loss that few words can fully capture. This system also fractured bonds within the enslaved community. Men placed in these roles were often viewed with suspicion or resentment by others, not because they held real power, but because the system forced them into positions that symbolized betrayal. Plantation owners exploited these tensions, knowing that division reduced the likelihood of collective resistance. In this way, dehumanization operated not only through control from above, but through the careful manipulation of relationships among the enslaved themselves. What makes this chapter especially difficult to confront is how deliberately ordinary it was made to seem. Plantation records discussed these men in the same tone used for tools or livestock, and conversations about productivity ignored the emotional and moral cost entirely. The language of efficiency masked the reality that human lives were being reshaped to fit a business model, one that rewarded output and punished any assertion of selfhood. Placed alongside the experiences of enslaved women, this story reveals the full architecture of the system that emerged after abolition efforts began. It was not random or chaotic. It was organized, intentional, and sustained by laws and social norms that defined people as property. Men and women were assigned different roles, but both were denied autonomy, family, and dignity in equal measure. Understanding the experience of enslaved men in this context deepens the larger narrative. It shows how slavery adapted by controlling every aspect of life, turning even the most personal human connections into instruments of profit. And it reminds us that the legacy of this system cannot be understood by focusing on one group alone, but only by seeing how the machinery of exploitation reached into every corner of human existence. As this system tightened its grip on the lives of enslaved women and men, its most devastating consequences fell upon those who entered the world with no memory of freedom at all. Children born under these conditions were never allowed the innocence that childhood should bring. From the moment they could be counted, they were measured not by their needs or potential, but by their future usefulness. Their existence was shaped long before they could speak, guided by decisions made in ledgers rather than homes. For enslaved mothers, the bond with their children was formed under the shadow of uncertainty. Every moment of care carried an unspoken fear, because no promise could be made about how long that bond would last. A child might be taken within months, or allowed to remain for a few years, only to be separated later when demand shifted elsewhere. This uncertainty became part of daily life, turning love into an act of quiet resistance rather than a protected right. On plantations where internal trade flourished, children were gradually introduced to the logic of the system. As they grew, they were observed closely, their bodies and abilities assessed with unsettling attention. Height, strength, and temperament were noted, not as traits to nurture, but as indicators of value. Long before adulthood, many children learned that their futures could be decided by someone they had never met, in places they had never seen. When separation came, it often arrived without warning. Families were divided not because of wrongdoing or necessity, but because of opportunity. In prices, a new plantation opening, or a shift in labor needs could trigger the sale of a child. For traders and buyers, these transactions were routine, conducted with the same formality as any other business exchange. For the children involved, they marked the sudden loss of everything: familiar faces, voices, and the fragile sense of belonging they had known. These forced separations shaped the emotional world of enslaved communities. Parents learned to prepare their children for uncertainty without ever naming it directly. Stories, songs, and lessons were shared quickly, as if time itself could be taken away. Older children often became caretakers for younger ones, stepping into roles far beyond their years, because stability could never be assumed to come from elsewhere. The internal slave market relied heavily on this constant movement of young lives. Children were considered especially valuable, not only because of their potential for long years of labor, but because they could be shaped more easily to fit new environments. This perspective erased their identities entirely, transforming growth and development into economic projections. Childhood became a waiting period, not for dreams, but for assignment. Yet even within these conditions, children found ways to assert their humanity. They formed friendships quickly, learned to read emotions and surroundings with sharp awareness, and adapted with resilience that speaks to the strength of the human spirit. These qualities, born out of necessity, were rarely acknowledged by those who controlled their lives, but they carried meaning within the community itself. Placing this experience alongside the stories of enslaved women and men reveals the full reach of the system that emerged after the end of the transatlantic trade. It did not simply exploit labor, it reorganized family, identity, and time itself. Children were not collateral damage, they were central to the system's continuation, treated as future labor units rather than lives in their own right. Understanding this reality completes the picture begun earlier in the story. The control of women's bodies, the coercion of men's roles, and the treatment of children as commodities were not separate practices, but interconnected parts of a single structure. Together, they show how slavery adapted and endured, leaving a legacy of loss and resilience that continues to echo long after the markets fell silent. as the system expanded to control women and children alike. Its deepest damage was not always visible in ledgers or markets, but in the lasting harm carried within bodies, minds, and families. Life on plantations imposed relentless strain, and over time that strain accumulated into widespread physical and emotional suffering that shaped entire generations. What emerged was not just a workforce, but a population living under constant pressure, where survival itself came at a heavy cost. The physical toll was immediate and unforgiving. Repeated childbirth, limited medical knowledge, exhausting labor, and poor nutrition placed enormous stress on women's health. Many were expected to return to work shortly after giving birth, often before their bodies had recovered. Complications were common, and infant survival was never guaranteed. Birth, which should have symbolized hope, was instead surrounded by fear and uncertainty, with outcomes shaped by neglect rather than care. Each loss was absorbed quietly, because grief was not something the system allowed time for. Children, too, bore the marks of these conditions from an early age. Weakness caused by hunger or illness was rarely treated as a call for protection. Instead, it was seen as a flaw, something that lowered a child's value or future prospects. Many never reached adulthood, and those who did often carried lasting health problems into later life. These realities were normalized within plantation routines, making suffering appear ordinary rather than alarming. Beyond the physical damage lay a deeper psychological wound. Families existed in a state of constant instability, knowing that separation could occur at any moment. This uncertainty shaped how people formed attachments, expressed affection, and imagined the future. Parents loved carefully, aware that visible bonds could bring pain if broken. Children learned early to adapt to loss, developing resilience not because it was encouraged, but because it was necessary. Over time, this emotional environment altered the structure of family itself. Traditional roles were disrupted, not by force. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and grandparents were often scattered across different locations, connected only by memory and hope. Family became something carried internally rather than lived openly, sustained through stories, shared traditions, and moments of recognition that survived despite constant disruption. The psychological strain did not end with one generation. Trauma passed quietly from parent to child, not through words, but through behaviors shaped by fear and vigilance. Coping mechanisms developed under extreme conditions became inherited patterns, influencing how future generations responded to stress, authority, and uncertainty. Long after the original system collapsed, its imprint remained, embedded in family histories and collective memory. This enduring impact reveals how deeply the system reshaped human lives. It was not limited to acts of control or exploitation, but extended into the inner worlds of those affected. Pain became routine, loss became expected, and endurance became a defining trait not because it was chosen, but because it was required. Seen alongside the earlier experiences of women and children, this suffering completes the picture of how the system functioned as a whole. Each part reinforced the other, creating conditions where physical hardship and emotional distress fed into one another. The result was a cycle that sustained itself over decades, leaving behind scars that could not be erased simply by ending the practice itself. Understanding this dimension of the story challenges us to think beyond timelines and laws. It asks us to recognize how systems of exploitation reach far beyond their visible structures, shaping lives long after they formally end. By acknowledging this generational suffering, we gain a clearer understanding of the human cost behind the history and why its echoes are still felt today. The clearest understanding of this history does not come from laws, statistics, or plantation records alone, but from the voices of those who lived through it, formerly enslaved men and women, once given the chance to speak for themselves, described a system that was neither accidental nor chaotic. Their first-hand narratives reveal that slave breeding was deliberate, structured, and sustained by economic interests, enforced routines, and social acceptance. These accounts strip away any illusion that what happened was the result of isolated cruelty. Instead, they show a system carefully designed to endure. Through memoirs, testimonies, and oral histories, formerly enslaved people described lives shaped by constant control and calculated separation. They spoke of childhoods defined by uncertainty, of families held together only briefly, and of identities shaped by forces beyond their control. Their words reveal patterns that repeat across different plantations and regions, confirming that this was not an exception, but a widespread practice woven into daily life. What emerges from these narratives is not just pain, but clarity, a recognition that the system functioned exactly as intended. These stories matter because they restore humanity to those who were denied it. They remind us that behind every policy and every economic decision were individuals who felt loss, fear, hope, and resilience. By listening to these voices, we move beyond abstract history and confront the lived reality of people who endured a system that treated them as replaceable parts rather than human beings. Their testimonies challenge simplified versions of the past and demand a more honest understanding of how deeply this system shaped society. The legacy of this history did not end when slavery was abolished. The structures it created, social, economic, and psychological, continued to influence generations that followed. Inequality, mistrust of institutions, and unresolved trauma did not appear out of nowhere. They were shaped by experiences passed down through families and communities. Understanding this connection does not mean remaining trapped in the past, but recognizing how history informs the present in ways that are often overlooked. Remembering these narratives is an act of responsibility. It ensures that the experiences of those who suffered are not reduced to footnotes or forgotten entirely. When history is left untold or softened, it risks being misunderstood or repeated in new forms. Honest remembrance allows for deeper reflection, meaningful dialogue, and a clearer path toward justice and understanding. As we bring this story to a close, the goal is not to leave you with despair, but with awareness of how systems adapt, how injustice can hide behind ordinary routines, and how essential it is to listen to the voices history once tried to silence. By engaging with these stories, we honor the resilience of those who endured and acknowledge the truth of what they faced. Thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect on this important chapter of history. If you found this video meaningful, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future discussions. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that the lessons they carry continue to be heard.